Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 29. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Happy New Year. It is 2025, and this is the beginning of what we'll call season 2, but we'll continue to just number them from the beginning. This is episode 29. I'm Jerry Swafford, PhD. By the way, the PhD is in mechanical engineering, so it is not in philosophy or theology or something like that. It seems like some people have gotten that mistaken. Today, I'm going to talk about a little bit about what we expect to do in season 2 and some of the things I've been thinking about going into the end of last year and going into the new year. And then we're going to talk a little bit about a video that I meant to do a reaction to. We haven't done any reaction videos yet. I tried to do it with StreamYard and it didn't work out. So I'm going to now just do a set of slides where I can do the reaction. So it's season 2. We are firmly and focused on apologetics in this season, and we may even get more focused than that in a specific area of apologetics. I don't know about that yet, but we certainly are going to stick with apologetics, really thinking about what we can see scientifically in the evidence for the existence of God, and also looking at the inspiration of the Bible. And so we'll be looking at those two areas in particular. We may get some into the deity of Christ, as we talked about last week, but those are the two major areas that we want to get into. And so there are a couple of ideas I want to talk about before we get to the reaction video today. The first one is something that I've really come to understand even more so after doing over 6 months worth of these episodes, and a lot of the comments that I've seen and interacted with, is that evolution and atheism are far more religious than you realize. And someone might be saying, well, no, that's not true. Evolution and atheism are talking about there not being a God, so they aren't religious. But it's actually true that they are religious. And this is true for a lot of things that we are encountering in the world today, things and ideas and issues. And so this is why you come across people, for example, like Mark Alsip that I interviewed last year, who has just written his new book. And so I may have him back on the podcast later on this year. But people that are saying that they are atheistic are writing and being opposed and saying that they are opposed to what they would call fundamentalism. And that opposition to fundamentalism, which in Mark's case, he would say that I'm a fundamentalist because I believe in the inspiration of the Bible and believe that it should be read naturally. These people that go against this, the issue is, if you really aren't for religion at all, then it really doesn't quite make sense to be opposed with the fervor and with the emotion that you often see with these people. And so, for example, we had a discussion about the literal nature of an eternal hell. This was something where he got a little animated, and for me, it was something that he was trying to oppose something that I believe firmly in. And so if these ideas like atheism, like evolution, are just cold scientific ideas, then people wouldn't be as animated and as emotional in their responses to the kinds of things I see. And so, for example, the video I'm going to be talking about today, there are comments like that that are just very emotional, and that is because we are striking at something where that hits you deeply because you firmly believe in these ideas. And so when I say evolution, I'm not talking about small genetic differences in species that everyone accounts for, everyone sees. And again, you can breed dogs and you can see that. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the bait and switch, where people are looking at those small minor genetic differences and then claiming that that every species, every organism for that matter, is related, and they all came from a common ancestor. That is a religious idea. It's not a scientific idea, and we're going to be talking much more about that in the new year. And so is atheism. You know, if it was just simply a matter of you not believing in a god or in gods, you might say, well, that's not religious. And sometimes atheists have made the point that, well, those of you who are monotheistic like myself, I believe in one God and the Lord Jesus Christ, of course, they would say, well, you already don't believe in all of the other ones, so you might as well just go one more and not believe in that either. And at first glance, that kind of sounds like there might be something to that. But the issue there is not believing in going from 0 to 1 is a huge jump, of course, and going from 1 to 0 is also a huge jump. And so the atheist that says, well, I don't believe in any, and can speak of that with surety and with certainty, that's a religious or a faith statement. And so one of the reasons why I called this podcast Faith Science is because my contention is that anyone that does science, anyone that does any kind of endeavor like this, you have to have a set of assumptions that you believe in. You have to have a set of assumptions that you have faith in. And so we have said this ad nauseum, but we will continue to say it because there are new people to the channel. Faith, belief, trust, and confidence are synonyms. Now, I had someone in the comments say, no, they're not. Please look it up. I could do it right now on Google, but I won't. But these are synonyms. So if you have confidence in anything, if you have trust in something or someone, or you believe in something, then that's faith. And so when I say faith science, I mean that what we're really wanting to tease out and pull apart are what are the assumptions that people make. So when you come to a conclusion like evolution, what are the assumptions that you have to make first? One of the things that we contend on this channel is that the assumptions that you're making are atheistic in their nature. And that's how you get to the conclusion that ends up being atheistic. But that's a circular process. It's circular reasoning to start off with atheism, then get to your evolution, and then end up with atheism, and then say that evolution proves it. It doesn't. You have to begin with the atheism first. And so that's something that we'll have more opportunity to talk about on the channel. The next thing is that creation and the Bible contain way more science than you think. And so this is something that we are trying to show more and more of. We talked with Dr. Don DeYoung and talked about some of the evidence for a young Earth creation view rather than an old Earth view or a progressive creation view or maybe a theistic evolutionist view. The issue with those other views is that they are a departure from what we see in scripture, from the natural reading of scripture. And I think some people often do that because they think that there is science that is very difficult, and that when we look at that, we're going to have to modify a natural reading of scripture in order to go along with the science. But we've seen on several of these podcasts is that's just not the case. And what happens is things that are called science are actually people who are atheistic who smuggle in their atheistic belief and then call it science when it's actually not. When we think about the origins of modern science, all of those people were believers. So we don't have anything to fear about science, and we don't have to modify the biblical record to line up with science. So creation, the creation account in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and just the Bible in general, there's all kinds of scientific stuff in there. There you can see statements that really line up with the first and second laws of thermodynamics, for instance, the law of biogenesis. We'll talk about some later. There's just so much science in there. There's the water cycle. There's the roundness of the earth. There are all kinds of things that you can find in Scripture that are way more scientific than you thought. And there, for those who would say, well, the Bible is just this Stone Age or whatever age book written by a bunch of uneducated people, what you find is that it continues to be it continues to be relevant. It continues to be the worldwide bestseller, and there are all kinds of truths that you find in it that are not just metaphysical and spiritual truths, but truths about what we see from a scientific perspective as well. So not only is our evolution and atheism more religious than you realize, but creation and the Bible contain way more science than you probably previously realized. And we're going to be pointing out much more of that this year on the podcast. So the reaction that I'd like to do on today's video is to this video where there was an interview done with Professor Major Coleman, who is a professor He was formerly with State University of New York, and basically there were clips from that went viral. I guess about a year ago. I just came across this maybe a few months ago, and so it was interesting because here's someone who is well educated, has multiple PhDs apparently. As someone with a PhD, I have no interest in getting a second or a third or fourth. I just don't understand why you would want that, but that's your business. I'm good with just the one, and but apparently he has multiple PhDs, and he has I think he has a doctor of jurisprudence, which is basically the law doctorate, and he was a professor there in New York. And while he was teaching there, he came across the fact that there was an evolutionary studies course that was there, or a group that was there. And he talked about in this interview how when he found out about that, he wanted to show the biblical data and show specifically about the ark and the flood of Noah in the book of Genesis, and how those were true events, a true account that was recorded there. And one of the things that he did is he challenged those people in that club or whatever it was where they were teaching evolutionary studies. He said he offered them $20,000 to come and conduct a formal debate with him, where he could talk about the evidence for creation and the science behind the Bible, as opposed to whatever they were saying. And surprisingly, apparently to them, no one stepped up and no one came and took the money. And this happened year after year after year while he was there, and they never kind of came through. And I think this is an interesting thing, because often what happens is there can be the sense that people will say, for example, there was a comment at the bottom of that video that said, this guy is just spouting rubbish, and what he's saying it with such conviction, but it's just all trash. There's nothing that he's saying that is actually true. And there's a sense that if you are in that bubble of evolution and atheism, that someone has probably told you that there's nothing to these ideas of about creation and about the Bible, about the book of Genesis, that these are just fairy tales. And as you have an opportunity to engage with this podcast or with this channel, one of the things I hope that you'll be able to see is that that's just really not the case. That we're not talking about fairy tales here. We're not talking about people who are just making up things, people who are uneducated, who are saying these things, but people who are highly educated, who have a great deal to bring from their background to this. My background personally is in engineering design, so that's what I like to go to, but I like to talk about some of these other things and talk to people who know some of these other areas like archaeology or prophecy, or the various things that help us understand and that bolster our faith in the existence of God and the inspiration of the Bible. So this isn't a case of, well, basically nobody's ever called these creationists on this stuff, but it's actually the opposite, that often evolutionists are unwilling to actually engage with the data and talk about what's there. What they would often do instead, and maybe there's less of this now, hopefully the tide is turning, but in many cases, they would just kind of say, well, we're not even going to dignify that because it's such rubbish. Why should I even talk to you about it? And sometimes I've encountered that in the comments, that when I then probe and say, hey, well, what are you saying that's actually wrong? Then often people don't really have an answer. They just say, well, it's wrong because, my professor in college, or if I talk to someone or and say, well, what is it about evolution exactly that would make you turn away from faith in the Bible, or faith in God, or in Jesus Christ? And people don't have a great answer for that. They just say, well, it's just obvious. Everybody knows that it's like that. But that kind of mindset is precisely the thing that is going to take you into a direction of something that is a false idea. That if you don't test it, if you don't look closely at it, then you won't be able to see whether it's right or not. If you just simply say, all the people that I like, or all of the people that I follow, or the professors, or the thought leaders, or influencers, they all believe this way, and they have an answer for that, so that's good enough for me, then you'll never actually be in a position to get to the truth. So hoping that that's something that you will be more willing to to engage with if you're watching these uh, podcasts or listening to these podcasts. So one of the things that he talked about in this interview as well is that the flood account in the book of Genesis is a true account. It's not just a fairy tale. And this is one of the things about the book of Genesis. When you read through the book of Genesis, it just doesn't read like a fairy tale. It doesn't read like something that should be taken as anything other than a historical narrative. So sometimes I come across, and I've had a couple of interviews recently with people who would call themselves believers in the Bible, but they would say that the Bible, in specifically something like the book of Genesis, should be taken as parable. It should not be taken as something that should be read the way it naturally is there, and it should not be taken literal, for instance, literally. So if it says in Genesis chapter 1 that God made the world in 6 days, well, that doesn't actually have to mean 6 days. And so there are these hoops that are being jumped through. And much of what we want to show is that the idea of evolution is a religious one. And so if you let go of the religious tenets of it, then you're much freer to be able to see the truth about things. But if you still hold on to those religious ideas of evolution, then it's very difficult for you to let go. And you'll say, well, no, it's not religion, but it is. Because if, as soon as I give a different perspective, you say, well, nobody believes that, or nobody of reputation or nobody of science believes that, then again, you're getting into the same idea that there are certain priests or there are certain preachers that you listen to, and if I say something that your favorite preacher or scientist doesn't believe, then you get angry at me and you say that I'm whatever you want to say I am, not really a person of science. But again, as is the case with Dr. Coleman, I've got my share of degrees myself, and they are in hard sciences. We're talking about mathematics. We're talking about engineering is what my background is. So I'm not one to just take something and throw out common sense or to throw out the science. So one of the things he points out is that Noah's Ark was a real structure. And he said there, I'm not sure about this because I don't know much about ships that have been built, but he said basically the Titanic was the first ship that was larger than the Ark. And so I don't have any reason to not believe him, but this replica here gives you a sense of the shape of the Ark, because probably if you're looking at vacation Bible school materials or Sunday school materials, it's generally not shaped like this, but it was a long, narrow vessel that would have been, we know this now scientifically, actually, we know that it had the optimal dimensions to be a seafaring vessel that was more like a barge that could carry a large amount of weight on it. And that's why it was able to survive, because God gave Noah the right uh, blueprint to build the very thing that would be able to survive. So one of the things that he shows kind of in this picture is that you see all of these really large dinosaurs, you see this really large whale, and you realize that you easily could have gotten some very, very large creatures on this ark and still had plenty of room to spare. And there are some large buildings, replicas of buildings put beside it so that you can see how very large this is. And one of the things he points out in the video is that if you think about the number of genera would be the plural of genus, I believe, but the number of genera that there are now, and you think about that all of those are descended from different kinds, that even if you just said if all of the different genera themselves were preserved on the ark, rather than there being some kind of microevolutionary process that's taken place since then, because all you would really have needed was just the different kinds of land animals, and then there would be different genera and species that might be descended from that. But even if you just say, look, we'll just take all of the current genera that exist, one of the things he pointed out that is that if you looked at them, the median of those would be something that was about the size of a rat. And so the fact is that you didn't need a lot of very large animals to be on the ark. And you could have gotten smaller versions of them, smaller kinds of them that could have gone on the ark. But even if you don't even take that particular approach, one of the things he shows is that some of the very largest dinosaurs that we have skeletons of would have easily been able to fit, and many of them would have been able to fit on the ark easily. So when people throw out the flood story because of its implausibility, often this is because they haven't actually looked at the details of it. And we'll need to do probably an episode just digging into or a series maybe digging into the Noah's flood and looking at different questions related to it. So Noah's ark was real. The flood account was true. So the thing that he said next, and this is where we'll kind of spend the rest of our time of the next few minutes, is the thing that he said next was that one of the problems with people espousing evolution is that it is based on four postulates or four major ideas that we've never observed. And so this is the religious nature of this, that much of what you are being told to believe, much of what you would have me to believe, those who kind of come in the comments and say this is ridiculous, I would really urge you, if you think about these four ideas, please show me what the evidence is for any of them, because there really isn't any. And so it's one thing if you want to believe that, if that's your religion. I'm not going to tell you you can't believe your religion, but just don't say it's science. That's the thing that is irritating to those of us who look at this and say, well, how can you say that's science? Is that these are faith statements that you're making. These are not science statements that you're making. But if any one of these is untrue, it really undermines the entire idea of the macroevolutionary hypothesis. Now, again, I'm going to call Big Bang a hypothesis. I'm going to call macroevolution a hypothesis. I'm going to call abiogenesis a hypothesis, because that's what they are in the strictest sense. They are not theories. You don't call something a theory that opposes laws of science and for which we don't have any evidence. You just call it a hypothesis. And I would argue that it's a failed hypothesis when you apply scientific laws to them. So here's the first postulate of evolution. Life came from non-life. In order for evolution to work, really what you're talking about, in order for, again, this atheistic idea that everything can kind of come about through quote unquote natural processes. They're not really natural. It's a supernatural thing to say that life came from non-life, but we'll suspend that for a second. In order for evolution to work, you have to first believe that life arose from non-life. Now, what often happens is when you bring this up and you bring up the fact that we have no evidence that such a thing has ever occurred and we've never seen it happen, and so there's no real reason why we should think that it ever did happen. When you bring this up to people, often what will happen is, again, they will say something like, well, yes, we don't see life coming from non-life, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And that's an interesting thing for someone who is claiming to be on the side of science. Because again, when we look at the four postulates behind evolution or from the biblical worldview, what you're going to find is that we're not saying life came from non-life. And so we're saying things that are actually you can show scientifically. But this idea that life came from non-life, that there were the elements, the all of the materials for life to be there, and that maybe some lightning struck or there was just something in this primordial soup, and then somehow life arose, is one of those things that is a belief. It's something you would have to have faith in, because it would seem to me is that if you're going off of what you can observe, we never observe life arise from non-life. So if the person from the evolutionary worldview is truly saying, I want to only go off of things that I can observe and see happen, well, you never see life come from non-life. So the question becomes, why is it that is somehow a tenable position for you? And the only answer I can come to is that it's tenable for you because it allows you to hold on to atheism. It allows you to hold on to a lack of belief in God. And if that's not the case, I'd be happy to see like what would it be. But again, starting from here, life comes from non-life is a fundamental part of this idea. And there are people that will say, well, we're going to eventually be able to do that in the lab. Now, even if we were able to do it in the lab, we would be doing it intentionally. It wouldn't be happening by happenstance through random processes. So even if we were able to take the building blocks of life and spark them somehow and create some kind of self-replicating molecule or something that we could say was alive, it would still be something that we did on purpose. Which, even if you're going to say that happened, that would be something to say, well, maybe a creator did that. Now, again, our creator isn't saying that life came from non-life. He's saying that life comes from life. And that's something we see in science. Here's the second postulate of evolution, that complex plant and animal life, including us, humans, came from single-celled life forms. Now, one of the things he points out is that you don't have two single-celled life, or you don't have two-celled life forms, or three-celled life forms, or four or five-celled life forms. You have single-celled life forms, and then you have complex life forms. There is not this progression where you can go out into nature and find a two-celled life form or a five-celled life form. That's not how it works. And yet, it's crucial that after the beginning of life from non-life, that then there was a progression where single-celled life became multicellular, and again, even more complex than that. Now, the problem is there is no in between, and this is very similar to what we're going to talk about in general. The problem with evolution is that there is no in between. There are no missing links between this. So there's no single cell and then a two cell, then a three cell, four cell, five cell. There's no links between this. Now, someone might say, well, maybe all of those links died off. And I guess that's possible. But again, we're not seeing single cell life forms become complex life forms now, but we're told to believe by this religion that you actually that's exactly what happened. There's just no evidence of it, or there's none of those in between forms. And so that's not there's no evidence that complex life came from single-celled life forms, but you need this in order for evolution to be true. The third idea is that time and chance drive evolution forward. Now, people often say this, and part of the reason why this is said is because when you think about something like microevolution, time and chance can be something that can be helpful in some ways. The classic example that we learned about in biology class was the moths during the Industrial Revolution. That you had these light-colored moths and dark-colored moths that were in existence in London or in England, wherever this was occurring. And when the Industrial Revolution took place, and they had factories that would put soot out into the air, that what happened is the soot would fall on the trees and the trees got darker. Now, what happened as a result is that the predators that ate these moths would be able to more easily see the light-colored moths because of all of the soot that was on the trees. And so what happened is that over time, previously, the light-colored moths were the dominant form. They were the dominant variation genetically. But over time, the darker colored moths became the ones that proliferated and were actually greater in population. But again, that doesn't show what you think it shows. It only shows that in this case, that this population of moths that already had the ability to be light or dark, the population just changed to where more of them were dark more often. But that has nothing to do with the moth having some different kind of feature. What we see is that different species, different organisms have different populations of organisms have a number of genes that are there. And you can't breed something that's outside of that genus or species with something that's inside of it. And so basically, everything in that species can breed, everything that's not cannot. And now what you have is there's really no way to have something that's much different because you can only breed with things that are close to being the same. So in this case, this idea of time and chance driving evolution forward, it actually doesn't help things. What's more is he didn't talk about this, but we've talked about the idea of genetic entropy. And one of the things about genetic entropy is the idea that over time there are mutations that are accumulating in the various genomes of different organisms uh, around the world, and the human genome is no exception. That as mutations begin to increase, there are more and more diseases that we're finding that have some kind of basis in genetics. Now, if that's the case, and this has been happening for millions of years, let's say, then you would think that we would be crippled, we would be in really bad shape because of the rising numbers of mutations. There are people that will say, no, mutations are good, and we need that the chance and the randomness of the mutations. It's just not the case. That's not what we see in the genome. Mutations are not making things better. It's not turning people into X-Men. It instead is actually causing a lot of disease. Now, it's not causing all disease, but it's causing a lot of disease that we see is because of genetics and because of the accumulation of mutations over time. And that actually goes against the idea of there being more time, or that the human race being around for more than thousands of years. That actually would suggest that if the human race has been around for millions of years, that there would be even more mutations that had accumulated and made us much more unfit and we would have a much more difficult time in our environment. So time and chance don't help evolution. It actually hurts it. And finally, minor genetic differences within a species is evidence of evolution. It is one of the most pervasive ideas when it comes to evolution. It's one of the things that I struggle the most with to try to help people who are evolutionists understand that one of the things that they do is that they will point to microevolution, and I'll say, yeah, that's microevolution. Nobody disputes that. And they say, but that's the evidence of macroevolution. And I go, but there's no macroevolution occurring here. And they say, well, and this is where they would go back to number 3, time and chance. Well, over enough time, these small changes that you see could become big changes. Well, that's a belief. That's something you have faith in, but there's no science for that. And so what people will try to do is they will take these kinds of ideas and they will take microevolution, minor changes among species, and use that as evidence for macro. But that doesn't work because, again, you're having to make changes that are no longer small changes. You're having to believe in changes that are no longer small changes. And so micro is not evidence for macro. And that's the easiest way I can say it. I'm going to try to find ways to say it and show it even more persuasively as we get into this year. But microevolution is not evidence for macroevolution. But this is really the main thing that the evolutionist hangs their hat on. And it's what's difficult about this is that I can understand Darwin making this mistake in the 1800s. I just don't understand how people are making this mistake in the 21st century. This is the mistake he made. He didn't know about cells. He didn't know about DNA, but we do. And so we understand that there are limits to the genetic differences that can occur within a species. We understand this, but people somehow suspend that knowledge or just ignore it because they want to believe what the conclusion is. So when you look at these 4 postulates of evolution, please think about them closely. Not one of them is scientific in nature. They are all religious. They are all something where you have to believe it and that there's no evidence for it. So not there's a little evidence for it. There's no evidence for it. And as we said in number 4, minor genetic differences is not evidence for macroevolution. And so saying, well, I can come up with a story that would account for that. And the story, again, is that, well, we had a common ancestor. Well, as we're going to look at next, the idea of the design hypothesis or the design inference is that a common designer will have similarities between the things that he designs. Okay, so what we're going to look at next is 4 postulates of creation is what this should be. So let me get that straight. 4 postulates of creation. And we're back. The 4 postulates of creation are that design demands a designer. This is the design inference. To me, it's one of the most compelling arguments for the existence of God. Design demands a designer. So when we look at this earth, when we look at this world, when we look at animals, when we look at humans, is one of my favorite to look at. We see design, we see purpose, we see within just the human body alone, we see parts that fit together that are accomplishing something. We see DNA that codes these different parts and functions and processes that occur in the human body and throughout the animal kingdom. That's a design. That demands a designer. And if we're thinking about this from a science or evidence perspective, we do not come across designs that were not made by designers. So if you want to look at these things and say that they look designed. I can't tell you how many evolutionists I come across that use terms like we are hardwired to do this. And I'm like, I agree, we are hardwired. But then they don't want to take that to the logical conclusion. We are hardwired to do things. God made us in a certain way to do things. But they don't want to take that to the logical conclusion, or they will say it's the blind watchmaker or something like that. Okay. Next, the earth and the universe are young, which is measured in thousands of years rather than billions of years. And this is something that I need to do a better job of talking more about on the channel and on the podcast. And so we will be talking about much more evidence that we can see in science that is often overlooked, is often not talked about, that shows that this earth is on the order of a few thousand years old rather than billions of years. Now people will say, well, what about this or what about that or what about starlight and all of these kinds of things? And we'll have an opportunity to talk about that. But to me, it's very compelling to look at these things. Look at one of the things he pointed out was that if you think about the oldest living organisms that we have on the earth are trees. And he says that the oldest trees that we have are something on the order of about 4,500 years old, which would take you back to about the time of the flood. And so that is a really interesting idea. You could say, well, that's just a coincidence. Well, maybe it is just a coincidence, but maybe it's not. And so that would line up precisely with what we see. We can talk about dust on the moon. We could talk about various different things. And so this is not my wheelhouse, but I'm going to get better at it. I'm going to be talking to people about it and getting better at describing all of the scientific evidence that corroborates the biblical dating of the earth at roughly 6,000 years old. Okay. So the third idea is that life forms of today are the basic kinds of life that were originally created with minor genetic differences between the species. So again, this accounts for the microevolutionary idea. And so this doesn't go against it. And so I think sometimes you can have some believers that think that what we see in scripture goes against that. But again, scripture simply says that there were different kinds that God made in the beginning. And so God made the genetic code. He made the DNA to account for being able to adjust to your environment. That's much of what's described when we talk about evolution, when we talk about things like being able to adjust or to the environment and for populations to do that genetically. And so those minor genetic differences between species, we see that in the life forms of today. And so the same kinds of life that we see today are basically the same kinds of things that God created at the very beginning. And finally, now this, again, I wouldn't say this is a creation idea, but this is more of an idea where he is referring specifically to the flood and the importance of it. And I think it is important. But he says that Earth experienced a worldwide flood about 4,500 years ago. And of course, there's an entire area of apologetics and to be thinking about with that, because that is a point that people really try to push back on. I found that people really pushed back when I talk about the age of the earth. That's one place. And I think some of the stuff with the flood was another place where people just got really angry and animated. And this is what we go back to what we said at the beginning, which is that evolution is way more religious than you think. And we're going to be talking more about that in the new year, that there's a whole lot more faith behind what you're calling science in that case than you think. Okay. So the three big ideas of evolution versus creation, the way I like to put them. So he had the four ideas, I have the three, and this is what we're going to end on today. I gotta go to a gospel singing in a few minutes. So the three big ideas I like to call them Big Bang hypothesis. The way I remember these three ideas is that they start with the letters BAE or Bay. So Bay, in order to believe in that, you have to believe in the Big Bang hypothesis, which is essentially matter coming from nothing. I know there are some of you that are going to get in the comments and you're going to say to me, well, it's not really nothing. And then I'm going to say, okay, so we're talking about the singularity. And you're going to say, well, yeah, the singularity. And I'm going to say, okay, so where does the singularity come from? And well, there will be an answer like, we don't know. And what I'm saying is, not only do you not know that, but you also just don't know that there is a singularity at all. You don't see anything in the slightest like that. So it's not like we've seen Big Bangs happen before. So we've never seen something like this happen before, but this is the idea that these are beliefs. These are religious ideas. And so matter from nothing is the first one. Obviously, that opposes laws of science. The second one is abiogenesis, life from non-life. We've already talked about that, but the technical term for it is abiogenesis. Third is evolution. We've talked about evolution as well, that complex life came from single-celled life forms with no purpose or direction. I wanted to add that last part because that's really what it comes down to. People think that there was just this haphazard design of things because, again, the apparent design is there, but instead of wanting to call it design, people want to just say, well, it just kind of happened and evolution did it. So those are the three big ideas of evolution of evolution. And here are the three ideas of creation that we are going to be talking about over and over again, and really trying to say it in different ways to help people understand, because I know that people are wrestling with this. So I'm not assuming that you're just coming in and you're completely closed off to the reality we're trying to show you. You're here because you're wrestling with this. So we want to try to help you see that the universe is created. It's not some Big Bang out of a singularity. It's just not. We see matter, we see it organized. And so when we see order rather than chaos, that means that there has to be energy injected into a system for that to happen. What we see in our world is that where there is order, there had to be something that happened to create that order. And someone had to do that on purpose. Because if you do nothing, you get disorder. The technical term from my thermodynamics classes was entropy. You get entropy if you do nothing. If you do nothing to your room, it doesn't clean itself. It doesn't get more orderly. And the same thing is true with any kind of matter that you see. But what they're saying with evolution is essentially that they get this order that just happens over time, and it organizes just right, and it creates systems, and there's no purpose behind it, even though we can see that things come together in a way that's helpful and that's useful and that works. But somehow there's no purpose behind it. That's a religious idea. That's not a science idea. The second idea is biogenesis, life from life. That is a law of science. The law of biogenesis. That's what we believe. But the evolutionist has to believe abiogenesis. Because if you don't believe that, then you end up having an idea that you have to completely throw out. Then finally, instead of evolution, what we're talking about here is design. When we see single-celled organisms, when we see complex life forms, we know that they are formed separately by God with purpose. And so we know why they're only single-celled and there are no 3 and 4 and 5-celled organisms, because that's how God made it. He made those single-celled, but he also made these other complex life forms. He made them for a purpose. So when we look and we see that purpose in the world, then we can see that there is a God. So that's it for today's show. We are going to stop there. And so I'll probably have the next 1 or 2 episodes will be solos, and we'll be fleshing out more of these ideas and kind of digging more deeply into these ideas about creation, about evolution, about atheism versus Christianity. And that's how we're going to start the new year off, really trying to go more in depth and really trying to provide more value in the podcast. So that's all for today. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep the faith.